Hello, everyone. Today, you were born not into noise, but into murmurs. Your mother didn't scream. Your father didn't weep. No crowds gathered to bless your name. Instead, when you entered the world, the old priestess who tended the birth whispered a chant beneath her breath, an ancient invocation to Hathor, patroness of motherhood, whose milk-white arms were said to cradle the souls of those destined for more than a life of soil and sweat. You weren't born noble, but your name was uttered inside the walls of a temple before it ever echoed in your household. It began with a dream, a simple one, really. Your grandmother saw a ibis fly in circles above her roof 3 nights in a row. No one gave it much thought at first. Birds do strange things, after all. But on the 4th night, she woke with salt on her lips and the scent of lotus in her hair. That was all the confirmation she needed. In the Egypt of the old gods, omens did not ask for permission. They appeared, and they were obeyed. The priests came on the 5th day, summoned not by your birth itself, but by the way the water in the family basin had rippled just before your mother's final contraction. A still basin, moved without wind. It was enough. You were wrapped not in rags, but in a strip of old linen stolen, reverently, from a temple storeroom. It had once swaddled a scroll of the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Now it held you. You didn't know this, of course. You only knew the warmth of skin and the press of quiet hands. But from your first breath, the world began shaping you into something it needed, not someone it loved. The stars above Memphis were quiet that night. And quiet is never just silence, not in Egypt. It is meaning. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And now, if you haven't already, dim the lights. Let your shoulders fall a little. We're about to return to the very beginning, to a life shaped by incense, duty, and gods that don't always answer. Your name was chosen not for sound, but for symmetry. A priest of Thoth carved it into clay before your parents ever spoke it aloud. It was read backwards and forwards, balanced like the eyes of Horus. Not just a name, but a structure, a promise, a blueprint. It meant something like, he who sees through fog, though no one would call you that directly. Names were masks in Egypt. They covered the true self the way bandages cover a wound, not to hide, but to protect. You were not raised to rule people. You were raised to rule silence. The first years of your life were not marked by toys, but by shadows. The sun fell differently inside temple courtyards. It didn't warm, it examined. As a child, you learned not to squint, even when the light was blinding. To squint was to admit discomfort. And discomfort, for a priest to be, was an insult to the gods who gave you breath. You did not run. Running was for children whose futures were shaped by the Nile's unpredictable moods. Floods, famines, fishing seasons. You belonged to a different tide. Instead, you walked slowly, always behind someone older, always watching how they moved. Even your footsteps were trained. Sand was not just sand. It was memory. Every print you left could be read by someone, human or divine. So you were taught to step lightly, to leave no mark unless asked. By age 5, you could recognize 37 different types of incense by scent alone. By age 6, you could sit still through the entire recitation of the hymn of the first dawn without scratching your nose. By age 7, you knew how to wash your hands 7 times before touching a scroll, not for hygiene, but for humility. And you were always watched, Not by your parents. They had surrendered you to the temple the way one surrenders grain to the granary. Not with sorrow, but with hope. No, it was the old priest who watched you most. He smelled of ash and honey, and spoke so slowly you sometimes wondered if he was delaying death just by refusing to finish a sentence. He didn't teach in the way modern minds understand teaching. There were no lessons, no explanations, only moments. Once you dropped a reed pen. He looked at you. That was all. But you never dropped another. There was a day, you remember it more through feeling than fact, when you saw a God. You were 8. You were not supposed to be in the inner court, but someone had forgotten to close the stone gate, and curiosity, like sand, always finds cracks. You stepped through. The air was thicker. Not hot, not cold, just aware. The statue of a moon stood before you, cloaked in lapis, its eyes painted with the kind of precision that makes real eyes feel clumsy. But it wasn't the eyes you noticed, it was the breath. Of course, the statue didn't move, it didn't inhale, but the room shifted, and something in your chest shifted with it. Later, they scolded you, not for disobedience, but for surviving it. To see a God unprepared was a risk to your soul, but they never sent you away, because the God hadn't rejected you, because the God had seen you. From that moment on, your life belonged more to ritual than to routine. You were bathed before dawn in water pulled from a sacred well, not touched by sunlight, not tasted by birds. You were shaved daily, head, eyebrows, even arms, to prevent impurity from hiding in unexpected places. You spoke less and less. Silence became a language. And when you did speak, it was in tones so measured they could calm a nervous ibex. You began to dream more vividly. Snakes that spoke riddles, flames that moved backward. A woman made of starlight who told you that your spine was a pillar of jed holding up the heavens. These dreams were written down, analyzed, interpreted by priests older than stone. Most were deemed auspicious. One was not. You were told never to mention it again. You forgot it by necessity. And still, you felt proud, because fear was just another proof of the sacred. One morning, the high priest himself touched your shoulder. He said nothing, only looked into your eyes, not at you, but through you. And then he nodded. It was the first real acknowledgement of your path. Not applause, not praise, just a nod. That was how the sacred moved in Egypt. Not through spectacle, through weight. You were 11. Now, let's breathe for a moment. Close your eyes if they aren't already. And imagine the world narrowing, not in fear, but in focus. Imagine that you have never heard the phrase, career choice. That your future is not a question, but a calling. Not an adventure, but an offering. This was how you began. Not with ambition, with stillness. The temple dogs barked once, always at dusk. No one knew why. Perhaps they saw something humans couldn't. Perhaps they warned away something humans shouldn't. You stopped fearing the sound. In fact, some nights you waited for it. The bark meant the day was ending. The world was shrinking back into the sacred. It meant the gods were settling into their statues for the night, and the weight of the living could finally rest. Even gods need sleep. Or so the old priestess said, her eyes twinkling like cracked glass. You never asked what she meant. Some truths in Egypt were not taught. They were absorbed, like heat or loss. You didn't miss the outside world. Not really. You heard it. The vendors calling out for barley, the laughter of river children, the squabble of ducks. But they were background noises, like the rustle of palm fronds or the sigh of linen robes. Your world was smaller, but deeper, not wider, but higher. You learned to see time differently, not as a line, but as a circle, not as progress, but as rhythm. You were not being prepared for life. You were being trained for eternity. You were still young when you realized silence has textures. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of breath held too long, of thoughts moving behind foreheads like shadows behind papyrus screens. The silence of the temple wasn't peaceful. It was layered. And as a child growing up within those sacred stone walls, you learned to listen not with your ears, but with your skin. Your early mornings began not with songbirds, but with the scrape of sandals on limestone. They were always the same sandals, leather so old it creaked like tree bark, worn by the junior priest who lit the oil lamps one by one. That was your first cue to rise, not that you were asleep. By that age, sleep had become more of a courtesy than a necessity. Your dreams were often broken by inner recitations, echoes of chants heard the day before, or images from the murals that adorn the inner sanctum. Serpents with wings, gods with crocodile teeth, boats that sailed through the stars. You didn't fear them. They were more familiar than your own reflection. The room where you slept was simple, a mat of woven reed. A jar of cool water changed twice daily. And on one wall, a single line from the maxims of Ptah-hotep, painted in ochre. The wise man is silent, but his silence speaks. At first you didn't understand it, but then again, understanding was not required. Reverence was. You learned that early. The temple was your home, but not in the way a house is a home. There was no affection in its corridors, no softness in its stones. And yet, you were shaped by it, smoothed by its expectations, worn down like a pebble in the Nile. The old priests never coddled you. When you asked questions, they looked at you like a wall does, steady, impassive, waiting for you to ask something better. When you cried, which you did once, a single word was spoken. Observe. And so you did. You began to notice things most people missed, like how the chief scribe always exhaled twice before dipping his brush, or how the sacred ibis kept one eye closed during morning rites, always the left, or how the statue of Osiris seemed to glow faintly just before the sun touched its feet. You were not praised for noticing. You were expected to. The gods, they said, did not speak in thunder or miracles. They whispered in patterns, in timings, in cracked stone and curling incense. To serve them, you had to tune yourself like an instrument. And so, your days became repetition, but not boredom. Repetition in the temple was sacred. Every movement, every chant, every gesture, done exactly the same, at exactly the same time, every day. It wasn't about ritual. It was about resonance. They told you, the gods are not eternal. The rituals are. They feed each other. You believed them. You had to. Your chores were small at first. Cleaning ink from reed pens, sorting bits of papyrus by size and clarity, carrying baskets of dried herbs from one room to another without letting the scent change. Each task had meaning. To smudge the ink was to disrupt a future contract, perhaps between a noble and a god. To misplace a scrap of papyrus could delay the copying of a funeral rite, leaving a soul unanchored. To bruise the herbs meant their essence would not reach the divine nostrils, an offense punishable not by men, but by cosmic balance itself. You learned precision through consequence, but it was the silences that stayed with you, the kind that filled the corridors just after the morning rites, the way the air felt denser, somehow aware of itself, as though the walls were listening, and maybe they were. Stone in Egypt was never just stone. It held memory. That's why the walls were covered, not with decoration, but with insurance. Every god, every pharaoh, every battle, every offering etched into eternity, not for beauty, but for survival. You used to run your fingers along the hieroglyphs, pretending you could feel the pulse of those who carved them. Sometimes you did. Your favorite place was not the main hall nor the sanctum. It was the scriptorium. It smelled of ink and candle wax and the faintest trace of old sweat, the kind earned by devotion, not labor. There, the air hummed with quiet industry. Scribes hunched over fresh scrolls, eyes squinting, tongues pressed to the roofs of their mouths as they copied prayers written long before their grandfathers were born. You were allowed to watch, never speak. And one day, when you were 10, they gave you a broken reed and a practice sheet. You wrote the first line of a hymn to Thoth, crooked, slow, but they didn't take it away. They let you finish. You were learning, not just language, sacred thinking. To write a prayer was not to communicate, it was to recreate. Each stroke was a tiny ritual, each loop a miniature offering. To write the name of a god was to summon their presence, however faint. That's why mistakes were feared. Not because they looked bad, but because they opened the wrong doors. One scribe once misspelled the name of Anubis. He spent 7 days in silence fasting, washing in cold water before dawn. He said nothing for the rest of the season. No one asked what he had seen. As your mind grew sharper, your body was shaped to match. You were taught posture, breath, endurance, not for battle, but for stillness. Try holding a cup of water for 2 hours without moving your hand, or kneeling in sand under the sun, unmoving, while a chant drones on for 97 verses. These were not punishments. They were preparations. A priest must embody stability. When the people look at you, they must see not a man, but a pillar. One day, a falcon landed near your foot during prayer. You did not flinch. The others noticed, and so did the gods. Let's pause here for a breath. Can you smell the incense? Faintly floral, slightly bitter? Close your eyes. Imagine the light, flickering, golden, licking the painted walls like whispers from the past. You are not just in a room. You're in a rhythm, a pulse that has beat for 3,000 years. And now, you're part of it. At night, your bed was no longer a comfort. It was a chamber of meditation. You were encouraged to replay the day, each gesture, each word, in your mind, like walking backward through time. If you forgot a moment, you were to assume that moment had power. Forgetting was failure, but you rarely forgot. Your mind had become a papyrus scroll, and your dreams were the ink. And then came your first real test. It wasn't announced. One night, just before moonrise, a priest touched your shoulder and said, "Follow." You did. Down the corridors, past the usual bounds, into a chamber you had only heard of, the room of the lesser judgments. Inside, 5 elders sat in silence, no fire, no offerings, just shadow and presence. They asked you no questions. Instead, they handed you a bowl of water, a feather, and a knife. And then, nothing. You were to act. It was a simulation, but not really. It was metaphor made flesh. You knew the stories. In the Hall of Two Truths, the soul is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. But what if the feather is wet? What if the knife is dull? What if your hands shake? You did what you had been trained to do. You breathed. You dried the feather, not with cloth, but with breath. You cleaned the knife, not with haste, but with precision. You placed the feather on the water's surface and waited. It floated. The elders nodded. One spoke. Balance. It was the only word you would hear that night. You were 13, and now, officially, a priest in training. The linen robe they gave you was rough, unbleached, and far too large. It trailed behind you like the weight of centuries. But you didn't complain, because it wasn't about comfort. It was about continuity. You weren't just being dressed. You were being remembered. And now, as we bring this chapter to a close, notice how your breath has slowed. Your thoughts softened. That's not an accident. That's the story doing its work. The temple didn't just train priests. It trained minds to enter a different kind of time. Slower, deeper, more ancient. You weren't becoming holy. You were becoming hollow. A vessel. So that something older than words could live through you. There comes a moment in every future priest's life when silence is no longer enough. You had mastered quiet. You had worn the linen. You had breathed incense and shadow for years. But now, the gods demanded something more. Not your thoughts, not your posture, but your skin. The first rites of initiation were not written on papyrus. They were carved into flesh by repetition, by deprivation, by reverence disguised as routine. You had reached the edge of your old life, and crossing it meant stepping barefoot into something that felt like death, but was actually something older, something sacred. It began, as all things did in the temple before sunrise. The priest who woke you said nothing. He only tapped your shoulder and handed you a folded cloth, coarse, beige, smelling faintly of cedar wood and sweat. You knew what it meant. You had heard the rumors from the older initiates. They never told you everything. Mystery was part of the rite, but they gave you pieces, stories. One had said, "You will not eat for 3 days." Another had whispered, "You will not speak for 5." But the most chilling had said simply, "When you return, the walls will no longer feel like stone." You had laughed at that once, quietly, alone. Now, you were not laughing. The purification began with water. Not a gentle bath, a plunge, cold, biting, pulled from a sacred well that had not seen light in a century. You gasped. You were not allowed to. 3 priests stood around the pool, silent, eyes closed, arms crossed. You emerged shivering, lips blue, skin tight. They handed you a cloth, not to dry yourself, to cover. And then They turned their backs. That, you later learned, was a mark of respect, or perhaps of fear. You were now in between. Not layman, not priest, not boy, not man. And those who dwell between are not to be looked at directly. You were taken to a small cell beneath the east wing. No windows, one bowl, one mat, one lamp. No sound save for your own breath and the occasional scrape of stone, rats, perhaps, or spirits. In Egypt, the line between both was thin. You sat and waited. The door was closed from the outside. Not locked. That, too, was a lesson. You could leave. But if you did, you would never return. The fast began at dawn. No food, only water, carefully measured, scented faintly with lotus to purify the body from the inside. By mid-morning, your stomach was silent, not empty, devout. By nightfall, you could feel your heart beating in your fingertips. By the second dawn, colors sharpened. Sound slowed. Thoughts stretched like reeds in the river wind. You were no longer in your body. You were beside it, watching it breathe, watching it ache. On the third night, the door opened. A single priest entered. He wore a mask, the head of Anubis, jackal-faced and shining with black resin. He said nothing. He placed a small brazier in front of you, lit it, and dropped in a pinch of something sharp-smelling, not incense, something bitter, something old. The smoke curled into your eyes. And then the chant began. Low, repetitive, older than any scroll. You had heard its rhythm before, but never its words, because the words were not meant for ears. They were for something deeper, something that sits beneath the ribs and listens when the mind sleeps. Your head fell forward, not from sleep, from release. You dreamed of doors, dozens of them opening and closing, some with hinges of gold, some made of light, others pulsing like hearts. And behind each one, not gods, not monsters. Versions of yourself, one younger, one older, one laughing, one weeping, one made of sand. You awoke with tears on your chest, though you didn't remember crying. The brazier was gone. So was the priest. You were alone again. But something inside you was no longer with you. On the fourth morning, you were told to walk. No destination, just walk. Down the halls, into the light, around the outer court. You had not walked in 4 days. Your legs trembled. The sun was too bright. Every step felt like it left a trail. Every glance from a fellow initiate felt like a question you didn't yet know how to answer. You walked anyway. That was the point. Pain, in this context, was not punishment. It was proof. You were not serving the gods yet. You were showing them you could suffer on their behalf. That evening, you were fed. Not food. Bread made without salt. Dry. Hard. Cracked like old limestone. But it tasted like mercy. With it, you were given a drink, not water. Wine, barely fermented, mixed with herbs. You sipped slowly, and for the first time in 5 days, your mouth remembered sweetness. It was enough to make you believe in joy again. But just for a moment, because the next morning you were taken to the chamber of smell. You hadn't known such a room existed. No one had spoken of it. Inside, 30 small jars were arranged in a circle, each sealed, each labeled with symbols you couldn't yet decipher. You were instructed to open one, inhale, describe it, not aloud, internally. You did. It was sharp, metallic, reminded you of blood on the hot stone. You moved to the next. This one, sweet, cloying like overripe figs, another musty like books left in damp caves, and another so cold it made your eyes water. You went on. 29, 30. By the end, your head spun. The world smelled different. The air was flavored. You were told to sit. The priest beside you, not masked, but veiled, handed you a slip of papyrus. On it, one word, Kepesh. You did not know what it meant. He did not explain. He only said, "You will understand when you serve it." The final rite was not public. No horns, no feasts, no drums, just you, a mirror, and a single linen strip. You were told to wrap your own eyes. You did. And then you were led, gently, wordlessly, through 3 gates. Each opened with a low groan, like a beast remembering its own hunger. You counted steps. 17, 12, 33. Then stillness. A hand pressed to your chest, and a voice, not one you recognized, said, "You're no longer what you were." The hand lifted. You unwrapped your eyes and saw nothing, because the room was dark. But in the dark, you smiled, because the dark was no longer a stranger. When you emerged, the other priests bowed their heads. Not deeply, just enough to say, "Welcome." You were not equal to them. Not yet, but you were no longer beneath them. You had entered the current. You were now expected to swim. Let's pause. You've been through a lot, even in imagining. Let your body sink a little deeper into your seat, your bed, wherever you are. Let the rhythm slow again. Feel the linen on your skin, or imagine it. Rough, plain, but blessed by hands that had touched stars in secret. You are no longer a child in this story. You are something else, a vessel being carved from belief. And the gods, they're watching now, with interest. Your daily life changed after that. You were no longer the errand runner. Now you lit the lamps. Now you carried the scrolls. Now you stood during offerings, not beside the priest, but just behind. Your hand on the ceremonial staff. Your mouth forming words you were not yet allowed to speak aloud. And at night, you slept deeper, but not for long, because new dreams came. Stranger ones, symbols, numbers, a woman made of smoke who whispered equations you couldn't remember on waking, a crocodile made of gold that wept silver tears. You told no one. Dreams were sacred and dangerous. Some opened doors, some opened tombs, and you never knew which until it was too late. You learned to walk more slowly, to eat more sparingly, to smile less, not because joy was forbidden, but because it was precious. A priest's smile must be real, or it must not appear at all. You were learning to be a guardian of rituals, of memories, of the space between humans and gods. That space, it wasn't empty. It was everything, and you were becoming its servant. By now, the temple no longer felt like stone. The older initiate had been right. It breathed, it remembered, and it had noticed you. You were one of its own, and it would never let you forget. There is a weight to knowledge that cannot be measured in scrolls. It settles in the spine, in the space behind your eyes, in the way your breath changes when you speak words that haven't been spoken aloud for centuries. Learning the language of the gods wasn't about reading. It was about remembering truths buried not only in stone, but in the blood, passed from priest to priest like sacred breath held between lifetimes. You were now in the time of study, not school, study. And in Egypt, study was a form of worship. The scriptorium became your second body. Your real body, shaved, perfumed, ritualized, was present. Yes? Kneeling, copying, chanting. But your other body, the one inside, was drifting higher each day. Above the glyphs, above the pages, above the hours. You were no longer writing to learn. You were writing to become. The hieroglyphs taught you not just what things meant, but how they felt. Each symbol was more than a picture. It was breath, story, memory, spell. The symbol for Ka, the soul's double, was not just two arms upraised. It was what you became each time you spoke it with reverence. The symbol for Mat, the feather of truth, was not just an ostrich plume. It was how you walked when no one was watching. And the Eye of Horus? It was not just a protection charm. It was a window into yourself. Some days your lessons began before sunrise. A bell, low, made of bronze, not to summon but to remind. You would rise, wash, wrap yourself in freshly pressed linen, and enter the Hall of Stars. There, beneath a painted ceiling that mirrored the constellations, you would study astronomy, but not like a scholar, like a priest. You didn't learn names of stars to catalog them. You learned them because each had a voice, and when certain stars rose together, certain gods woke up. That's why rituals had to happen at the right hour. The gods listened through light. You began keeping 2 calendars, one for the temple, precise, astronomical, sacred, the other for your own mind, the calendar of changes. It tracked not dates, but moments. When you first translated a full hymn without stammer, when you understood why the scribe always paused after the name Isis, when you touched a papyrus older than any living person and felt its silence hum in your fingers. These were your milestones, not birthdays, not holidays, but revelations. You were taught the names of herbs, not in the way a healer might use them, but how a god might request them. Frankincense for clarity, myrrh for mourning, blue lotus for communion. Each scent opened a different doorway. Each resin carried a vibration, not metaphorically, but truly. You felt it in your jaw. You learned to mix them with care, to burn them with precision. Not too fast, not too much. A rushed offering was worse than none, because the gods, above all, demanded intent. One afternoon, the high priest placed a scroll before you. No title, no markings, just the faint scent of old cedar and a single glyph on the outer ribbon, Shesep, to receive. You unrolled it slowly and found not a prayer, not a list, not a myth, but questions, written centuries ago by a priest long dead. Riddles, puzzles. Each line ended not with a period, but with a feather, as if asking, how light is your answer? You didn't try to solve them all. That wasn't the point. You read one aloud and sat with it for a week. If the tongue can build a pyramid, what shape does silence leave? You still don't know, but the question changed you, and that was enough. Your voice, once hesitant, began to shift. You weren't louder, just slower, more precise, because you now knew the cost of words. A priest doesn't say things, he places them, like bricks in a temple wall. Wrong word, wrong place, and the whole structure trembles. So you chose carefully, even in thought, especially in thought. Once, a younger initiate asked you why the gods spoke in riddles. You told him they didn't. We do, because clarity is too bright for the mind. We wrap it in metaphor to protect ourselves. The gods are direct. It's us who walk in spirals. Your studies took you beyond paper, into objects, the sacred tools, not decorative, but functional. The scepter, shaped like a shepherd's crook, reminded you that leadership wasn't command, it was guidance. The ankh, symbol of life, taught you that living well meant living deliberately. Even the scarab, lowly beetle to most, carried lessons. It pushed its burdens backward, yes, but always forward, always toward the light. You began to train in the language of ritual movement. Every gesture had a counterpart. Raise the left hand while reciting Heka, and you conjure healing. Raise the right, and you might call storms. Precision was survival. It wasn't superstition. It was structure. The universe, they said, runs on rhythm. Your job was to never miss a beat. And oh, the chants. Layered, monotonic, infinite. At first, they bored you. But boredom, you learned, was a gate. Beyond it, trance. Repetition was a stairway. And each verse was a step. By the 100th recitation, you no longer heard the chant. You became it. One evening, during a chant to Ra at sunset, your voice caught, not from exhaustion, but from something else. You couldn't explain it. It felt like your chest opened, not painfully, but profoundly, and something ancient looked through you. Just for a second, it passed. No one said anything, but the high priest placed his hand on your shoulder afterward and nodded. That night, your dream was simple. Just a wall, covered in names, none of them yours, and a space, empty, waiting. You woke with tears in your mouth, not sadness, not fear, but a kind of awe, because now you knew. You weren't just learning history, you were joining it. Let's pause again. Feel your chest rise. Feel the rhythm. Slow, steady, ancient. You're learning the way the priest learned. Not in haste, not for power, but for presence. To be with what came before, and to prepare for what's to come. Eventually, your lessons turned toward the afterlife. Not the one in stories, but the one built brick by brick beneath the city. You were taken to the tombs, to the chambers beneath temples, to the crypts where the air grew still and the walls whispered names. You read funerary texts, not as myth, but as maps. The soul, you learned, was not judged by its acts alone, but by its balance, its truth. And as a priest, you would one day be its advocate, its witness, its shield. You copied spells from the Book of the Dead until your fingers cramped. You memorized the negative confession, 42 denials of sin, spoken before judgment. You practiced saying them with your eyes closed, because you would one day speak them on behalf of the dead, and the gods would listen. By now, your dreams were different. No longer symbolic, but clear, direct. Instructions, warnings. Once you dreamed of a falcon with a broken wing. The next day, a scroll was torn in the scriptorium, one containing hymns to Horus. Coincidence? You no longer believed in that word. Everything was a signal, some clearer than others. Your final test as a student came not in a classroom, but in the field. You were sent to aid in the burial of a low-ranking priest, not a noble, not a scribe, just one of your own. His family was poor. The rites were modest. but you carried them out as if he were a pharaoh. You anointed his brow. You whispered the hymns. You placed the amulet on his chest with shaking hands. And when you looked down at him, this man you barely knew, you wept. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough for the gods to notice. When you returned, you didn't speak for 3 days. No one asked why. They knew. You had learned the final language, the one without words, the one only the soul can hear. And now you were ready, not to teach, not to lead, but to serve, with full understanding of what it meant to carry eternity inside a single breath. You had spoken enough. That was the first lesson of the next phase. Words were now tools, precise, sacred, and dangerous if misused. But there was something more important than speech, something harder to master, something that would define your role more than the scrolls, more than the rites, more than the incense ever could. Silence. Not emptiness. Not absence. But silence as presence. A space so full of attention that it hums, not with noise, but with meaning. And in Egypt, silence wasn't avoidance. It was command. You had now lived within the temple for most of your conscious life. You could recite the hymn to the rising sun backward. You could mix anointing oil by scent alone. You could summon the correct name of Isis in any of her 11 aspects. But could you be silent in truth? Not just quiet, not just withholding speech, but hold silence the way one holds a bowl of oil. Still, even as the world shakes around you, that was the next rite, not ceremony. Discipline. It began with a change in your routine. Fewer duties. No scrolls. No chants. You were assigned to the courtyard of the hours, a place where no one spoke, where priests passed each other with nods and bows and nothing else. The walls were high, the sounds muffled, and the ground was swept every morning by boys too young to speak aloud. You were given a seat in the corner, a block of smooth limestone worn down by decades of previous occupants. And you sat for hours, for days, not idle, not vacant. You watched the way shadows shifted along columns, the flight patterns of pigeons nesting in the rafters, the sweep of sand grains when the wind was just right. Everything meant something. You just didn't know what. Yet. You were not allowed to write, not allowed to signal, not allowed to gesture with purpose. Only observe. The silence became heavy after the second day. By the third, it became light again, like breath, like sleep, like memory. By the fourth, it wasn't silence anymore. It was conversation. But the speaker wasn't outside you. It was within. They taught you during this phase that noise is a tool of power, and that true power is knowing when not to use it. In the palace, voices rise to command. In the market, to bargain. But in the temple, to speak is to risk, because every sound has weight. Every syllable touches the divine. If you are careless, you don't merely offend. You unbalance. You invite confusion into a place meant for order. There was a story you were told, not in class, but during a rare whispered conversation between senior priests one evening. A young priest, newly initiated, had spoken the wrong intonation during the Festival of Lamps. He meant to say, "Hey, Kit, bring renewal." He said, "Hey, Kit, bring reversal." The city flooded the next day. No rains, no broken dams. The Nile simply rose, fast, angry, and in the wrong direction. Coincidence? Not in Egypt. So you practiced in silence, not muteness, not passivity, but a form of listening that reshaped your inner self. You learned to listen with your fingertips, to hear emotions in the tension of shoulders, to read atmosphere in the flutter of curtain cloth. The temple itself began to speak, not in sounds, but in pressures, in shifts of air, in vibrations beneath your feet. And then, one day, during a moment of particular stillness, something happened. A bird, a small green bee-eater, flew into the courtyard and landed near your feet. It looked at you, not startled, not frightened, just present. And for several long minutes you sat together. Two creatures of breath and bone, two vessels of life. And you knew, without words, that this moment meant something. Later, you were told the bee-eater is associated with renewal and clarity. But you didn't need that explanation. You had felt it, without needing to say it. Let's pause. Slow your breathing. Let your shoulders sink again. And feel what it's like, truly, to not fill space with words. Not to distract, not to explain, just to be. This was your training. To carry a presence so still it soothed the chaos in others. To hold space like a basin. Still, sacred, deep. After your time in the courtyard, your tasks resumed. But now, you were different. You walked slower. Not lazily, deliberately. You answered questions with fewer words, and people leaned in more, not less. You no longer needed to speak to be heard. The priests began to send you as their emissary during disputes. Two temple workers arguing over storage, they sent you. You said nothing at first. Just looked at each man, nodded, and waited. Eventually, they settled the matter on their own. You had only provided the space. Silence, you discovered, was not absence. It was invitation. When you stopped trying to fill the air, others began to fill it with what mattered. Confession, insight, understanding. You were becoming a mirror, not reflecting faces, but revealing souls. There was an older priest, blind, partially bent, slow to speak. He had once served in Thebes, they said, before the river swallowed half the southern docks. He asked to speak with you one day. His chamber was dark, lined with papyrus scrolls that hadn't been touched in decades. He motioned for you to sit, and then nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, just a breath. You waited for an hour, two, and then, without explanation, he spoke. Just one sentence. Silence is not the absence of voice, it is the presence of weight. You didn't ask what he meant. You didn't need to. You felt it. In the evenings during your private meditations, you began to practice a new ritual. Sitting by a small oil lamp, you would think through your day. And for each moment you had spoken, you would ask yourself, was that sound necessary? Not as guilt, as refinement. And slowly, your speech became thinner, but richer, like gold beaten into thread. One day, a young boy spilled ink over a valuable scroll. He panicked, shouted, cried. Others rushed to scold him, but you entered the room and said nothing. You looked at the scroll, then at the boy, then placed your hand on the table beside him. No rebuke, no judgment, just presence. He calmed, cleaned the mess, and later returned with a recopied scroll. Better than the original. That was the moment the other priests began calling you not initiate, but teacher. Your silence had become trust, not just with the gods, but with the people, the workers, the children. Even the animals began to act differently around you. Cats sat closer. Birds lingered longer on nearby walls. The temple dogs, usually restless, slept beside your path. It was as if your body had become a tuning fork, vibrating in rhythm with the sacred pulse of the place. And the gods, they noticed too. You no longer heard them as voices, but as shifts in wind. Chills that arrived without cause. Heat that flickered across your skin like distant flame. You were no longer praying to them. You were listening with them. One night, during a moonless vigil, you sat beneath the pillar of Jed, the sacred backbone of Osiris, symbol of stability. You touched its base and felt, not stone, but rhythm, a heartbeat, slow and ancient, pulsing upward. It wasn't your imagination. It was memory, echoing through the monument into your hand. You stayed there until morning without needing to know why. This was your gift, not prophecy, not power, but stillness. You were no longer a boy seeking favor. You were becoming a channel, not for speech, but for meaning. And as we end this section, just breathe. Notice the quiet around you. Not as emptiness, but as presence. In that quiet, something sacred waits. And you, like the priest you've become, are learning to hear it. The gods were no longer ideas to you. They had been stories once, yes, then symbols, then principles and forces you memorized, revered, invoked in chant and in gesture. But now they were becoming present. Your silence had prepared the ground. Now it was time to enter. To meet the god, not in metaphor, but in ritual. Not in thought, but in form. And in Egypt, that form had weight, texture, scent, sound. The gods lived in statues, not as decoration, not as symbol, as dwelling. Temporary, perhaps, but real. And the first time you stood before one, you understood why even the most experienced priests sometimes wept. Because what you feel is not belief, it's gravity. You were told the night before. The high priest summoned you without announcement. You followed him in silence through the cloisters, across the courtyard, into the hall of oils. There, 10 small vials waited. You were to anoint yourself in sequence, one for clarity, one for humility, one for inner light. Each had a scent that brought with it a memory not your own, as if the oil carried not just fragrance, but time. You wept during the 3rd. You laughed during the 6th. You didn't know why. The high priest said nothing. But when you finished, he nodded once, placed a hand on your shoulder, and whispered, "Tomorrow, you will face presence." That night, you barely slept. Not from fear, but from a kind of alert stillness, the kind that lives just below the skin, waiting for dawn. You watched the moon pass behind the pillars. You listened to your own breath until it felt no longer yours. You repeated verses in your mind, but softly, not for rehearsal, just for comfort. By the time the lamps were lit outside, your heart was steady, because you were ready, not to perform, but to witness. The first thing you noticed that morning was the quiet. Even the birds seemed to know. The Temple of Amun was never noisy, but today it was reverent. The other priests averted their eyes as you walked by, not out of shame, out of respect. You were about to enter the naos, the holiest space, the innermost chamber, the place where the god lives. Few did. Fewer still returned unchanged. You were dressed in pure white linen, 3 layers. Each nodded in a different direction, past, present, future. Around your neck, a small amulet, not gold, not stone, just a carved symbol of life, warm from the hands that blessed it. You were not armed. You carried no tool, just your breath and a basin of sacred water, drawn before sunrise from the well of the dawn. The procession was brief. No crowd. Just two senior priests, the keeper of the inner door, and a boy carrying the oil lamp. The light flickered as you passed beneath the lintel, and then the door shut behind you. You were inside, and everything changed. The room was small, not grand, not echoing, tight, close, like a womb carved in stone. At its center, the statue, Amun, ram-headed, tall, seated, his face carved with precision so delicate that it seemed to breathe and the flames tremble. His eyes were inlaid with obsidian. You didn't look directly at them. You were told not to, because to meet the god's gaze before you're ready is like looking into the sun underwater, disorienting, blinding, heavy. So instead, you focused on the floor, on your feet, on your breath, and then the rites began. The high priest stepped forward first. He spoke, not to you, to the god. Soft syllables, rhythmic, layered like waves over sand. You recognized them from memory, but here they felt different. Less like recitation, more like conversation. Then your name was spoken, and you stepped forward. You poured the water slowly, over your own hands first, then over the small altar basin. The sound, gentle, echoing, was like rainfall in a tomb. The priest handed you the cloth. You dried your hands, reached forward, and touched the base of the statue. It was warm, not from heat, from presence, like touching the back of a living being who has just turned away. And in that moment, you knew. This was not a carving. This was not an idea. This was a moon. Here, now, looking, not at you, but through you. You wanted to speak. You didn't. You had been told, presence is not a call for words. It is an invitation to listen. So you did. And what you heard was not sound, but weight, not pressure, gravity. Your limbs softened, your jaw loosened, your spine straightened, not by effort, but by instinct. You were becoming a column, a vessel, a staff. The priest began the hymn. You joined. Voice low, measured. Not performance, alignment. Each word was like a step across invisible stones. You didn't try to sound powerful. You tried to sound true. And the god listened. Not because you were special, but because you were prepared. That's the difference. Gods do not favor the talented. They favor the attentive. The next phase was the offering. A bowl of bread, a plate of figs, a cup of barley beer. You presented them not as food, but as essence. The god would not eat. The god would receive. Not the item, the intent. You bowed 3 times, each time deeper, each time slower, and then stepped back. The priest lifted the veil from the statue's head, a rare act, done only once per cycle. And for a moment, the chamber brightened, not with light, with awareness. Even the flame paused. Even your lungs hesitated. And in that frozen space between one breath and the next, you felt seen. Not judged, not exposed, just witnessed, entirely, without filter, without mask. And you understood why so many never entered this room again. Not out of fear, out of reverence too deep to repeat. The veil was lowered. The flame dimmed. The door opened. You stepped out, and the world felt lighter. Not because it changed, because you had. Let's pause now. Let that moment settle. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Imagine your own breath as sacred, as a connection between the seen and unseen, between the stone and the soul. You're not just remembering, you are participating. You didn't speak for the rest of the day. You didn't need to. The other priests looked at you differently now. Not with envy, not with praise, with knowing. You were now one of them, not by name, but by experience. You had seen the God, and the God had seen you. That night, you lit a lamp in your own chamber. You placed a single offering beside it, a fig wrapped in cloth, and whispered a short phrase, not a prayer, not a thanks. Just, I am here. Because now you truly were. You thought the God was the peak, that nothing could weigh more than standing in the Holy of Holies, touching carved stone alive with presence, seeing the veil lifted just once in a season. But you were wrong, because what followed was heavier, not spiritually, politically. You had learned the rhythms of ritual, the poetics of prayer, the unspoken music of silence and oil, of chant and gesture. But now you would learn the other language, the one not written in papyrus, but in glances, the one spoken not in temples, but in corridors, the language of power. A priest, especially a high-ranking one, did not live in isolation. He lived inside a web of nobles, of scribes, of merchants, of Pharaoh. And you, slowly, were being woven into that web. At first, it was subtle. You were invited to accompany the high priest to outer functions, blessings before grain assessments, prayers for shipping expeditions. You stood to the side, said little, but you watched. And what you saw had nothing to do with incense. The vizier smiled, but never looked anyone in the eye. The general bowed too low when speaking of border affairs. The tax minister always touched his thumb to his lip when lying. And the pharaoh's youngest son? He lingered near the sacred pool, not to pray, but to listen. To what? To whom? That was the question you were meant to ask. Silently. Always silently. Because in Egypt, information wasn't gathered. It was received. You began to see it clearly. The priesthood was not just a spiritual class. It was a political body, as essential to the state as the military. More so, perhaps, because generals needed victories. But priests, they only needed continuity. And in a country where the Nile's flood could mean feast or famine, continuity was divine currency. Temples owned land, not metaphorically. Acres, granaries, vineyards. They collected taxes, oversaw trade, employed craftsmen and herdsmen and scribes. And at the center of all that stood people like you. People who had been silent so long, others assumed they knew everything. You were summoned to a private meeting. Not ritual, business. In the shadowed hall behind the temple archive, 3 elders sat. One you knew well, one a master of the agricultural cycles. Another, a keeper of the temple stores. The third, a man dressed in linen too fine to belong to a priest. A royal advisor. You bowed. They spoke, not in code, but not plainly either. There had been a shipment delayed in the delta. Grain owed to the temple by royal decree. But delays meant gaps in distribution. Gaps meant questions. Questions led to audits. And audits uncovered things. Your job? To oversee a blessing of the royal storehouse, publicly, visibly. To cleanse it, spiritually. Symbolically, which would conveniently reset the record, and postpone any review for another season. You didn't argue. You nodded. And when you left, you realized this wasn't deceit. It was balance, the kind you had been trained to maintain. Mayhat wasn't just truth. It was order, even uncomfortable order. From that day, your responsibilities changed. Not drastically, just more often. More doors opened. More names spoken to you in confidence. You began to be consulted. Not about prayers, about people. Is the new steward of the granary trustworthy? Can the regional governor's son be counted on? Will the priests of Bastet support this year's festival budget? You didn't always know the answer, but your opinion mattered because you listened more than you spoke, and that, in political Egypt, was power. Let's pause here. Breathe. This is a different kind of sacred, one less shiny, one that smells not of frankincense, but of parchment and sweat. It's still holy, because it keeps the world spinning, but it's complex, and so are you. You were assigned a personal scribe, not a student, a peer. He followed you quietly, noting every meeting, every request. He slept near your chamber. He ate after you ate. He never spoke unless asked. You wondered how long it would take until you trusted him. It happened the day he corrected a date on your travel scroll, and was right. After that, you gave him access to your prayer journal. And he never told a soul what he saw. You began traveling more, to minor temples, to estates, to outer districts, not in luxury, but with authority. You represented more than yourself. You were the face of Amun's will. And the will of Amun? It was stability. In one village, a fight had broken out between local farmers and the estate keeper. The dispute? Water rights. The village claimed ancestral access. The estate claimed royal grant. You listened for 3 days, and on the 4th, you suggested moving a sacred stone, a boundary marker, 10 cubits east. It wasn't a legal answer, but it was symbolic. It showed compromise. The villagers accepted. The estate accepted. The flood came that year just enough to cover the new line, and that stone remains there still. You were not solving problems. You were tuning chords. The land was a harp. Your role was to keep the strings from snapping. But with power came risk. One morning, you woke to find a scorpion beneath your mat. Another day, a servant's son went missing after delivering a scroll. Whispers rose. Not everyone appreciated a priest who saw too much. But you had been trained to observe without reacting, to respond without alarm. You reported nothing, but you quietly moved your quarters closer to the guards and requested that your scribe begin learning prayers of protection. One day, the pharaoh's chamberlain arrived, in person, not with retinue. Just a single guard. He asked for a private audience. You gave it. He spoke softly. There had been dreams, troubling ones. The king was unsettled. The queen, too. They requested a priest, not to interpret, to sit, just to sit beside the royal bedchambers through the night. You accepted, without question, because this, too, was service. The palace was not like the temple. It smelled of oils too sweet, voices too loud, eyes too restless. But the king, he was quiet, tired. When you entered, he did not sit up. He only looked, and you nodded. No ritual, no verse. You simply sat through the night until the dream came. He spoke in his sleep, phrases from old liturgies mixed with names from the underworld. You wrote nothing. You offered no interpretation. But in the morning, the queen left a pearl on your bed, and you knew you had done enough. Let's pause again. You're deep in the current now, not just of religion, but of human power. It's murkier, but still sacred, because balance must be kept, even here, especially here. By now, your face was known, your name spoken not just in temples but in court, and always with caution, not fear, but respect. People lowered their voices when you passed, not because you demanded it, because you embodied something they couldn't quite name. And you didn't chase influence. You let it arrive, right? Like the flood, like the wind, like grace. You learned to sign documents with a symbol, not your name. A feather tilted left, meaning by weight, not will. It became your mark, and those who knew understood. You were not there to rule. You were there to balance. Balance wasn't theory. It wasn't a virtue or a symbol painted on temple walls, or a philosophical ideal to be debated over dates and wine. Balance was your job. Every day, every breath. The cosmic principle of harmony wasn't something you believed in. It was something you maintained. Like a brazier kept lit. Like a scale calibrated at dawn. Like a breath held between verses. At this point in your life, no one questioned your presence anymore. You moved with purpose, and the air around you moved with you. You entered a room and conversation slowed, not from fear, from awareness, because the priesthood didn't shout to be heard. It existed, and that was enough. Your days were not dramatic. They were ritual. And ritual in Egypt was not theater. It was engineering. Each action designed to support the structure of existence itself. The sun rose because the proper words were spoken. The Nile flowed because offerings were made. The world turned because you, and others like you, kept the wheel from wobbling. You woke before light, not from alarm, from rhythm. The body adjusted over time, responding to duties like tides to the moon. You sat up slowly, lit a single lamp, whispered the same phrase you whispered every morning. May today remain aligned. And then you began. Your first task, washing the self, not for cleanliness, for preparation. Water, drawn from the temple well before the stars had faded. Cold, still, poured in silence. You washed from head to toe, reciting under breath. Remove from me the dust of confusion. Let only clarity remain. Then linen, then oil, then breath. By the time you walked the corridor toward the sanctuary, the city was still asleep. Only the bakers and the boatmen stirred, and even they moved like ghosts in mist. You were the first light, not symbolically, literally. The first fire lit each morning was yours, and it was not a match. It was flint and patience. You struck the stone, once, twice, spark, smoke, flame, tiny at first, then stronger. You whispered, "This is not fire. This is the spine of the world," because it was. Everything you did from that point was in service of balance. The incense, the chant, the re-oiling of the god's statue. Each action a counterweight to the chaos that never stopped trying to enter. Even in stillness, it pushed. And you, priest, servant, guardian, pushed back. Not with force, with ritual. Repetition was not laziness. it was safeguard. When you poured water over the altar basin, you weren't cleaning. You were reaffirming the Nile's loyalty. When you lit the seventh lamp, you weren't creating light. You were reminding Ra that the journey west must end in the east. You knew, of course, that others laughed. Merchants, soldiers, foreign envoys. They saw ritual as superstition, as quaint, as nostalgic. But they didn't see what you saw. They didn't know that if you stopped, just once, something would shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but subtly. And then, slowly, the frame would warp. The flood would come too soon. The stars would misalign. The harvest would spoil. And the people would whisper, "The gods are displeased." They wouldn't blame you, but you would know, because it was your job to notice. Let's pause. You've lived with noise all day. Let it fade. Take a breath. Now another. Picture your own life like a temple. Each routine a pillar. Each habit a prayer. Each silence a stone holding up the roof. You too maintain a world, even if it's only your own. Back to your duties. You had mid-morning readings. Scrolls, not myths, instructions. How to prepare oils for funerals. How to calculate the sacred angle for tomb inscriptions. How to read omens in ibis migration. You copied. You studied. You debated. Softly, always softly, with those who could match your quiet rigor. You were not trying to learn everything. You were trying to learn enough. Enough to keep the balance. Enough to repair it when it wobbled. You visited the workers at midday, not to preach, to observe. They knew you. They offered you dates, bread, the occasional carved trinket, tokens of affection, not bribes. You ate what was offered, never refused, because part of your balance was connection. A priest who becomes distant becomes brittle, and brittle things crack under strain. You sat with a brickmaker one afternoon. He spoke of his son, gone 3 years now, taken by the cough. He asked you if the soul travels as fast as the river. You didn't give him scripture. You gave him metaphor, faster, because the soul moves with memory, and memory doesn't need a boat. He smiled, and in that smile, something shifted, something balanced. That too was your work. Later, you met with 2 scribes. One was worried. The archives had a missing scroll, not lost, borrowed by someone without permission. You didn't raise your voice. You simply asked, what was the scroll? It was a fertility chart, harmless, mostly, unless used to time festivals without proper calculation. You nodded, requested it returned in silence. No punishment, just correction. Because balance means knowing which scales need resetting and which can tilt just a little. By dusk, your body ached, not from labor, from presence. Being attentive for 12 hours straight is heavier than stone. But you didn't falter. You moved to the west gate, lit the evening torch, recited the setting hymn, and whispered, "May darkness enter gently." Because balance was not about favoring light. It was about welcoming both. That night, in your chamber, you removed the linen slowly, folded it, placed it on the east-facing shelf, poured a cup of barley tea, drank it warm, no sugar, just ritual. You sat, back straight, hands resting on knees, and whispered, "Did I hold the world today?" You listened, not for answer, for echo. And when the room remained still, you smiled, because stillness was permission. Let's breathe again, longer this time. In through the nose, out through the mouth, 3 times. Now, imagine your hands, open, held flat. On one hand, chaos. On the other, order and your task. Not to eliminate either, but to hold them steady. That was your life. That was Egypt's secret. You didn't seek applause. You didn't desire legacy. You desired continuity. The river flows, the stars return. The chant is spoken, and the statue glows with oil, and no one sees the 1,000 tiny acts behind it. No one knows that your spine ached when you bent to light the last lamp. No one remembers the 22 breaths you took to calm a brewing argument among novices. No one knows. But May-8 knows, and that was enough. You worked in the light, but you belonged to the night, because it was at night that the temple spoke most clearly. Not with words, with presence. And presence, when the stars were high and the corridors cold, became almost unbearable in its purity. The rites of the dark were not written for the crowds. They were not public, not celebratory. They were maintenance of the breath between things, of the space between waking and dreaming, of the gods who needed reminding, gently, nightly, that humans still believed, even when the torches burned low. Your duties after sunset changed over time, but the rhythm remained the same. You walked slowly, always alone. The corridors were silent, yes, but not empty. Statues cast long shadows that shifted as your flame moved past them. Some nights they seemed to breathe, others to whisper. You knew better than to speak back. The gods were not looking for conversation. They were listening for devotion. And your steps, your silence, your steady flame, they were the only answer required. You began each night in the antechamber of sleep. That's what they called it. A small room where you sat cross-legged and whispered the words to close the day. Night is not absence, it is waiting. There was a basin of water, not for washing, for reflection. You looked into it before lighting the flame, not to check your face, to check your alignment. The water didn't lie. If your thoughts were scattered, the surface rippled. If your mind was still, it stilled with you. Only when it held you like glass were you ready. The temple after dark was not dangerous, but it required a different kind of attention. No footsteps echoed. The floor was built to absorb them. The oil lamps hissed softly, like the breath of something dreaming. Every movement, slow, every gesture, careful. You weren't walking. You were passing through, like a shadow in a story, like a voice between verses. You visited the minor altars first, not the great shrine, the small spaces tucked into corners hidden behind columns. Altars for gods few remembered. Taweret, guardian of childbirth. Bes, the ugly-faced protector of sleepers. Nehebkau, the serpent who joins body and soul. You left oil. You whispered their names. And each time, something shifted in the air. Gratitude? Recognition? You never knew. But the silence felt warmer after. The rites themselves were simple, not lesser. Simple. A single flame lifted. A drop of oil traced across stone. A line of verse, old, almost forgotten, spoken not with grandeur, but with memory. The gods didn't need you to impress them. They needed you to remember, because memory is devotion, when done in silence. Let's pause for a breath. Let the noise of your day fall away. Imagine a temple corridor, cool and dim, a flame cupped in your hand, a wall of carved stone beside you. And your breath, slow, sacred, alone. Now continue. The main sanctuary came last. Always last. Not because it was most important, because it was heaviest. You entered alone, carried the flame. The statue loomed. You didn't look directly, but you felt it. The god was awake, in that strange, slow way the divine exists. You bowed 3 times, then sat. Just sat. You didn't speak yet, because first, the listening. You allowed your thoughts to drift, but not far. You allowed your breathing to deepen, but not loud. And in that space, you waited. Not for a sign, for presence. Some nights the god said nothing, but you felt things. Pressure behind your eyes, heat along your arms, images, feathers, serpents, desert winds, passing through your mind like dreams that didn't belong to you. You didn't try to interpret. You simply received. That was enough. Other nights, something stranger happened. You heard things. Not clearly, not aloud, but like memory turned sound. Phrases from your youth. Words from dreams long forgotten. A name whispered 3 times. One you'd never known, yet recognized instantly. The voice didn't frighten you. It grounded you, because it didn't come from outside. It came from the space between your thoughts. And somehow that was more real than any sound you'd ever known. One night, the god turned away. Not physically, but you felt it. The presence that had always hummed gently receded, and you panicked. Just for a second. Did I err? Did I forget a step? Did I come impure? But then the wind stirred the lamp, and the flame swayed, and you understood. Even gods rest. And presence is not obedience. It is relationship. And relationships require space. You stayed, waited, spoke no words, and as dawn approached, the wait returned. Not loudly, just settled, like someone returning home. You bowed, whispered the closing line, "We are not forgotten," and left. You never told anyone about that night. Not because it was forbidden, because it was yours. And sometimes the most sacred things are the ones never spoken aloud. In the mornings, no one asked what you saw. They asked if the oil burned clean, if the floor was swept, if the offering plates were in their place, the practical, physical things, because the rest, the invisible, that was not for them. It was for you, and for whatever watched you in the dark. Let's pause again. Imagine yourself as the night priest, one hand full of flame, the other empty, ready. Your feet soft on stone, your eyes calm, your voice held back like water in a cup. And above you, the stars, always in place. Because you were in place, because you kept the story moving, even when the world slept. You were now trusted with night visions, dreams, not yours, others. The novice who dreamed of falling endlessly, the mother who saw her child walking into water, the merchant who swore his brother called from beyond the grave. They came to you, not for prediction, for meaning. You never told them what to believe. You asked questions. When did the wind shift in your dream? What color was the sky before you fell? Did your brother say your name or think it? And their answers shaped your guidance, because interpretation wasn't revelation. It was relationship between the dreamer and what they feared, between the image and what it begged to heal. You became a kind of anchor, not flashy, not famous, just consistent. The person people came to when the world turned sideways at night. Because you had walked those corridors. Because you knew how to light a flame when no other fire remained. Not every night was mystical. Some were just quiet, ordinary. A candle that wouldn't light. A mouse in the storeroom. An ache in your knees from too much stillness. But even those moments were part of the work. Because even gods need companions on slow nights. You were that companion. You remained. Even when the incense faded. Even when the hymn faltered. Even when the silence grew long, because your presence said, "We still care." And sometimes that was all the divine needed. Your body stopped belonging to you the day you took the final vow, not in a metaphorical way, not in a poetic sense, literally. Your skin, your voice, your breath, your very shadow, all became extensions of the temple. Not property, not possession, but instruments. And like any sacred tool, they had to be purified, preserved, and hidden. Because the gods didn't live in statues alone. They lived in you. This was not vanity. It wasn't about beauty or pride. It was discipline, sacred embodiment. If you walked slouched, the chant suffered. If your breath was uneven, the incense carried wrong. If your hands trembled, the oil spilled. Your body was the ritual, even before the rites began. You woke each morning to cold water. Not just any water. It was drawn before dawn, left untouched by the sun, carried in silence and poured with prayer. You did not splash it on your face. You received it. Over the head, down the back, over hands held in offering. 7 times, each pour accompanied by a whisper. May this vessel remain empty enough for light. You never missed a day. Not when sick, not when exhausted, not even when traveling. Because this was how you remained tuned. You were shaved daily. Head, face, eyebrows, even arms. Not for fashion, for purity. Hair carried scent, dust, sweat, memory. And memory, when ritual required forgetting, was a burden. So the blade became your confessor. It took your yesterday and left you bare for the sacred now. You ate alone, always, and never whatever you wanted. Your diet was not preference, it was alignment. No garlic, its pungency disturbed the breath of the gods. No fish, it belonged to the Nile and to ancient taboos, grains, fruits, nuts, a few sacred herbs. No wine, except in controlled ceremonial doses. Water, always warm, never drunk in haste. Food was not fuel, it was rhythm. It was a way to remain still, even in digestion. You moved deliberately, not slowly, precisely. Your posture mattered. A crooked spine was a crooked prayer. Your hands were trained not only to hold scrolls, but to hold stillness. Even your footsteps had choreography. Heel, ball, toe. Each step placed with the same care you used to place offerings. Because your movement echoed in the walls, and the walls remembered. Let's pause. Feel your breath. Not just in the lungs, in the arms, the back, the legs. Now imagine that breath is not yours. It's borrowed, on loan from something older than wind. And your task? To use it well. That was your everyday. You perfumed yourself with oils not for fragrance, for sanctity. Each oil had meaning. Myrrh for clarity. Cedar for grounding. Lotus for calm. You anointed wrists, throat, soles. You never wore too much. Too much meant assertion. Too little meant negligence. Balance was everywhere, even in scent. You never touched another person casually. Not even friends, not even family. Touch was sacred. It created energy. It passed memory. If you laid a hand on someone, you changed them. And they? You. So you didn't do it lightly, and rarely without ritual, even in grief, even in joy, especially in joy, because joy left traces. Your garments were simple, always linen, always white, always clean. You owned no dyes, no jewelry, unless symbolic and ritually granted. Your adornment was silence. Your beauty was posture. You had learned. The less you carried, the more space you left for the divine. Your body was not yours, but you still felt it. The aches in the knees after long standing. The burn in your calves after prostration. The dryness in your throat after long chants. You never complained, but you noticed. And in those moments, you remembered pain was part of presence. It kept you humble. It kept you aware. And it reminded you, even sacred flesh is still flesh. You didn't fear death, but you respected decay, because decay meant disorder. So you remained alert to signs, to shifts, a cough that lingered, a nail that cracked. You tended to the body not for vanity, but for continuity. Because if you faltered, even slightly, the ritual rippled. Once you tripped, just once. Entering the shrine, your sandal caught the edge of a step. You didn't fall, but you wavered. And for days after, you fasted. Not from punishment, from recalibration, to remind your legs what steadiness felt like. To tell the gods, I noticed. You lived like a whisper, but never disappeared. Your presence mattered to novices, to fellow priests, to the gods, because in a world of noise, your stillness was a kind of guidance. At night, you rubbed oil into your shoulders, chanted a closing verse, and sat with your eyes closed, not meditating, not emptying, just returning to the rhythm, to the breath, to the body, because even the sacred must return to itself. Let's pause again. Feel your body. Now, where is it heavy? Where is it quiet? Where is it asking for attention? This is what the priest asked himself every evening. Not for wellness, for witness. Because the body, too, is a temple. And temples need care. You were not invincible. You aged. You stiffened. The skin grew thinner. The hands less steady. But you adapted. You shifted the rhythm. The prayers got slower. The steps more intentional. But the work never faltered. Because the gods didn't need youth. They needed devotion. Once, a boy asked if you ever wished to be free, to walk barefoot through the market, to laugh loudly, to eat honeyed fish by the river. You said, no. But you smiled. Because, of course, once you had wanted that. But now you had tasted something sweeter. The dignity of being hollowed out, so something eternal could pass through you. And that was enough. More than enough. You thought you knew death. You had chanted its names, read its symbols, anointed altars in its honor. But you hadn't touched it. Not really. Not until the day you entered the embalming room. And then you understood. Death wasn't the end. It was work. Detailed. Demanding. Sacred. The room smelled of resin and salt. Not rot. Rot was banished here. This place was for transformation, not decay. The walls were smooth, the air still, and at its center, the body. Naked, pale, waiting, not with fear, with expectation. Because here, the dead were not mourned. They were prepared, not buried, restored. Your mentor greeted you without a word, only a nod, His hands were stained dark from natron and myrrh. He passed you gloves made from linen and motioned toward the table. "Begin with the oil," he finally said. And that was it. No lecture, no prayer, just the ritual, the work. You didn't flinch. You had trained for this. You had read the texts. But reading is not the same as touching. The body was cool, not cold, firm, not stiff. And as you poured oil across the forehead, you whispered, "You're not gone. You're shifting. Not for the soul, for yourself, to steady your hands, to steady your breath." The process was long, painstaking, beautiful in its discipline. Organs removed with care, placed in canopic jars, each guarded by a divine son of Horus. Liver to Imseti, stomach to Duamutef, lungs to Hapi, intestines to Kebesenuef. You learned their names by heart, because to forget them was to dishonor the dead. And dishonor? That was the true death. You washed the body with wine and spices, not to cleanse, to honor. Every cut closed with resin, every fold wrapped in layers of linen. One for protection, one for memory, one for light. You chanted as you wrapped, verse by verse. Not fast, not loud, but rhythmically. Each word stitching time into fabric, each phrase sealing memory into silence. Let's pause, close your eyes. Picture a dark room lit by oil flame, the scent of cedar, a linen-wrapped form before you, and your own hands unsteady, sacred, slow. This was not horror. This was return. You began to understand that death was not an interruption. It was a continuation, a path walked backward into the arms of the beginning. And you, as priest, were the guide. The midwife for the soul's departure. The opening of the mouth was your first solo rite. You held the adze, a small ritual tool shaped like a tongue. You stepped to the mummy and recited, "May he speak again. May his breath be true. May he name the stars." You touched the mouth gently, the ears, the feet, symbolically unlocking the senses for the afterlife. It wasn't magic. It was memory, returning faculties lost in silence. Later, at the tomb, you stood with the family. They cried. Of course they did. But not like those who see death as ending. They cried as one cries at a long journey's start, with love, with fear, with hope. You placed the amulet over the chest, whispered the secret name, and stepped back. Your part was done, but the journey just beginning. After that, the dead visited your life more often, not as ghosts, as presence. You saw them in dreams, in shadows, in memories not yours. You began to hear your own voice in your sleep, reciting passages you hadn't reviewed in years, and waking with the scent of lotus on your skin. You never questioned it. You just noted and added oil to the lamp. You kept a journal of the dead, not names, impressions, how they smelled, what they made you feel, how long the linen took to wrap without tearing. You wrote, "Today, her hands were folded perfectly. I did not cry, but something in the air did." Another day, the child had a scar on his lip. I touched it gently before the first oil. It felt like closing a story too short. These notes were not records. They were reverence. Let's breathe again. This time, slowly. Inhale through your nose. Hold. Now exhale through your mouth. Picture the breath as something leaving you gently, not dying, just transforming. Now you understand the death priest's path. It's not grim. It's tender. You began teaching others, You weren't the oldest, but you had touched enough silence to be trusted. You showed novices how to hold the scalpel, how to fold linen without wrinkle, how to chant without rushing, and, most importantly, how to look at the dead without fear. Because fear was noise, and noise disrupted the passage. One student wept. First day. The body was young, only 13. He whispered, "She's my sister's age." You placed your hand on his shoulder and said, "Then treat her as your sister. But let her go as a daughter of light." He nodded, wiped his eyes, and never cried again. You saw your own death more clearly with time, not as dread, as inevitability, as routine. One day your name would be whispered by another priest. One day someone would anoint your forehead, bind your hands, speak your secret name aloud for the final time. You didn't fear it. You prepared for it. Every day. With every rite, your body too began to change. Slightly. A new ache in the hip, a tremor in the thumb. Nothing dramatic, but reminders, markers on the path. You began writing your own funerary verses, not as obsession, as offering, so that when your time came, the words would already know the way. The dead taught you more than any scroll. They taught patience, stillness, humility, because they did not praise, did not correct, did not argue. They just were. And that was enough. Let's close here, gently. Feel the quiet, not empty, not hollow, full of memory, of reverence, of bodies wrapped in linen and in love. You're not afraid now, because you've walked beside death and found it sacred. You never asked for visions, but they came, not every night, not on command, not with ceremony, but with a kind of softness, a ripple in the dark, a shimmer on the edge of sleep that made you understand. Some dreams aren't yours. They're echoes, leftovers from the gods, or from something deeper still. You never bragged about them. The old priests warned against it. They said, the moment you claim a dream as a gift, it becomes a mirror. And mirrors distort when held too long. So you kept your dreams close, not secret, sacred. You recorded them at dawn, on thin pieces of papyrus, rolled and stored in a clay jar beneath your sleeping mat. You never shared them unless asked. And even then, only if the moment was quiet enough to deserve them. The first one came when you were still a novice, a bird with human eyes, perched on your chest. It didn't move, it didn't blink, it just watched. When you woke, your chest felt heavy, not sore, marked. And that day, you were summoned to join a funeral rite. It was your first time near the embalming tools. When you saw the ads, you froze. It had the same curve as the bird's beak. Coincidence? Not here, not in Egypt. Another night, you dreamed of a river running backwards. Slow, glassy, quiet. Along its banks were children building pyramids from ash. Each time the wind blew, the structures collapsed. But the children didn't stop. They just built again. And again. You told no one. But the next week, a scroll arrived from Thebes. The grain storage had failed. The taxes would fall short. The temple would need to sacrifice one of its planned construction projects. Ash, wind, rebuilding. These weren't predictions. They weren't warnings. They were whispers. Not about events, about meanings. And you learned to listen, not to the dream itself, but to what changed afterward. The silence that followed, the breeze that shifted, the way a novice looked at you, just a beat too long. and everything meant something. You just didn't always know what. Let's pause. Take a breath. Imagine lying on a mat of woven reeds. The stars overhead, the smell of warm stone and faint lotus in the air. You close your eyes, and something unfamiliar slips in with your breath. That's where the visions begin. Not all dreams were symbolic. Some were direct. Names, dates, a snake curling around a throne, a woman crying beneath a palm tree, repeating a phrase over and over. The left door opens first. You wrote them down. You never interpreted too quickly. You let them age, like wine. Some dreams ripened with time. Others soured into forgetfulness. But the ones that stayed, they changed you. Sometimes others came to you with their dreams. You listened carefully. Rarely spoke. Often you'd simply repeat one part back to them, a single detail, and let the weight of hearing it aloud do its work. A merchant dreamed of a broken boat drifting upstream. You said, "Was it morning or evening?" He paused, said, "Evening." And that was all he needed to realize he was holding on to a trade deal past its time. Interpretation, you learned, wasn't translation. It was revelation, guided by careful attention. Not all dreams brought peace. Some left you shaken. Once you saw the temple burning, not with fire, but with light so bright it peeled the walls away. You woke trembling, but no disaster followed. Instead, that day, an old storage chamber was reopened, and a lost cache of scrolls rediscovered. One of them, a forgotten hymn to Ra, describing the sun's eye as a cleansing fire. You learn not to fear unsettling visions, because not all transformation is gentle, and not all brightness is safe. You kept a stone beneath your pillow, obsidian. It was said to absorb noise from the dream world. On nights it grew warm. You knew something had passed through. And on those mornings your breath felt heavier, like the echo of a bell long since rung. You began to track your dreams against the calendar, not to control them, to notice them. They followed cycles. The new moon brought symbols of rebirth. The full moon, reckoning. Equinoxes stirred visions of water and eyes. Solstices brought silence. Deep silence. As if even the gods were holding their breath. You once dreamed of a jackal with your face. It didn't speak. It simply walked beside you through a desert of glass. At one point, it stopped, looked at you, and blinked. Not with eyes, but with its entire body. A full body shiver. And then it vanished. You wrote, "Some parts of me know how to survive longer than I do." Dreams weren't only visions. Sometimes they were feelings. Waking up with sorrow you didn't earn. Joy you couldn't explain. Gratitude so strong it brought you to your knees before breakfast. And each time, you poured water into the offering basin with a little more intention, because you weren't just offering it for yourself anymore, but for whatever passed through you. Let's pause again. Let your eyes soften. Let your body settle. And imagine a night where your sleep is not escape, but invitation. Where each dream is a hand reaching out. Not from the past or future, but from the in-between. Would you take it? Would you follow? Some dreams left marks. A word etched into your memory. A scent, frankincense and sea salt, that lingered all day. A rhythm that played behind your thoughts for weeks. You called them shadows. They never explained themselves, but they never harmed. They just waited. And one day, A moment, a verse, a person would illuminate them, and the dream would make sense. Perfect, terrifying, sacred sense. You were not the only dreamer. Other priests saw things, some louder, some darker, but few had your patience. Most wanted answers. You were content with questions, because questions are doors, and the sacred never rushes through. Eventually, the high priest asked you to begin keeping the dream ledger, a scroll of dreams recorded not by name, but by symbol, one page for each season. You wrote carefully, never interpreting, only recording. And over time, you began to see patterns. Snakes increased before political tension, birds before flood changes, weeping women before childbirth surges. The gods didn't warn, they reflected, and your task was to notice. Not all dreams were holy. Some were yours, born from memory, from fatigue, from loneliness. You had one dream recurring of walking barefoot through the temple. But every time you reached the shrine, it was gone. Just dust. You never told anyone. But each time you had it, you spent the next morning cleaning the shrine floor by hand, slowly, as if to convince your soul that it was still real, still there, still yours. You never claimed to be a prophet. You rejected the word. Too loud, too heavy. You were a listener, a vessel, a reed in the wind, catching vibrations not meant for shouting, only for guiding. That was enough. That was everything. You no longer walked like other men. Not because your body changed, but because the air around you had. You didn't speak louder. You spoke less, and people listened more. Not because of what you said, because of what you carried. And even if they didn't understand it, they felt it. That was enough. In the market, vendors lowered their eyes, not out of shame, out of uncertainty. Were you watching? Were you judging? Were you listening to something they couldn't hear? They didn't know. You didn't say. And so they watched you with caution. Children whispered your name. Not in games, in dares. Touch his robe, one said once. The boy hesitated, came close, but never did. Instead, he bowed, awkwardly, earnestly, and ran. You smiled, but said nothing. The gods were always listening, even in jest. You were respected, but rarely invited to weddings, to celebrations, to meals under open sky, not because you were unwanted, because you were unreachable. People didn't know how to sit beside someone who spoke to gods, someone who guided the dead, someone who saw the invisible and still managed to sleep at night. Even your family grew distant, not cold, just cautious. Your siblings spoke softer when you visited. Your mother cried once, quietly, behind a veil, when you declined the fish she cooked, as you always did. You touched her hand gently, whispered, "I remember its scent," and she smiled, because that was your way of saying, "I still carry you." Let's pause. Feel what it's like to be both needed and held at a distance, to be revered, but not embraced. This was your life, and it too was sacred. You began to walk at night more often, not for ritual, for solitude. The city sounded different after dark, the footsteps less hurried, the prayers less formal. Sometimes a voice hummed through a window. Sometimes a child cried in sleep. And sometimes the silence stretched so long it folded into the stars. And you felt peace, not because you were alone, because you were allowed to be. The living treated you with a kind of holy hesitation. But the dead? The dead came freely, in memory, in dreams, in the way certain rooms felt colder than others. You welcomed them, not as ghosts, as guests, because you had helped them cross. And some came back to say thank you. Once, while walking through the outer court, you saw a shadow that didn't move with the sun. It paused when you paused. Not mirrored, accompanying. You nodded, quietly, and it vanished. You told no one, because not every visitation needed audience. Some were just moments. The servants in the temple called you the quiet one, not because you were silent, but because you softened sound. When you entered a room, the volume dropped. Arguments paused. Breath slowed. You didn't try. It just happened. And they noticed. But not everyone admired you. Some feared you. Some envied. Even among other priests. Not all hearts are clean under white linen. One spoke against you, subtly, in meetings, in scroll notes. Nothing direct, but enough. The high priest noticed. You were summoned? He asked, "Do you know what's been said?" You answered, "Yes." He said, "Do you deny it?" You said, "No." Not because it was true, because denying would have fanned the fire. And you knew. Silence is the sharpest blade. It cuts deepest when no one sees it drawn. Weeks passed. The whispers faded. And the one who spoke, assigned to a border temple, far from Thebes. You never asked why. You never celebrated. You simply added an extra offering that night and whispered, "Let the balance return." Let's pause again. Feel your chest rise and fall and rise again. You don't need applause. You don't need to be right. You only need to be still. You became a symbol, a story. To others, you were not a person. You were a presence. They spoke of you in third person, even when you stood beside them. He walks at dawn. He eats only what he blesses. They say he can speak with the moon. None of it was entirely true, but none of it was false either, because presence distorts, like heat above desert stone. You didn't resist it. You let them have their stories, because stories are anchors. And if you could anchor someone, even by myth, that too was service. There were moments when the isolation pressed inward. Nights when even the flame felt far. When the silence didn't comfort, but echoed. When you missed laughter, missed error, missed being just a man. But those moments passed, like storms, and you remained. Not unmoved, but centered. You began speaking less even in council. Others filled the space, debated scrolls, argued rights. You waited, and at the right moment, said 3 words. 4. Sometimes just 1. And the room stilled, because you didn't speak often. But when you did, it felt like a hinge turned. Once, a woman approached you, older, veiled. She said, "My husband cursed you with envy." You said, "I know." She said, "He's dead now. Do you forgive?" You touched her hand and replied, "I never withheld." She wept. You let her, then offered her water. That was enough. And in this balance between reverence and solitude, you thrived. You rooted, like a tree growing silently in temple stone, feeding on light no one else could see. You reached the top quietly. There was no trumpet, no public ceremony, no grand declaration. Just a meeting, a nod, a linen robe folded in a particular way. And from that day forward, people stopped looking you in the eye. Not out of fear. Out of reverence so deep, it became distance. You were now the voice behind the veil, the stillness at the heart of the ritual, the one whose name was written last on the scroll but thought of first when the world began to tremble. You weren't just a priest now. You were the priest, the anchor, the axis, and with that elevation came the final sacrifice, intimacy. No one asked how you were anymore. Not because they didn't care, because they assumed you no longer existed in such terms. To them, you had become function, a role, a concept, and perhaps, in a way, you had. Your chamber was moved closer to the sanctuary, not larger, just quieter. You now slept within the sacred perimeter. Only two others had keys. One was the High Archivist, the other, the Night Flame Keeper. You trusted both, but still, you checked the door yourself each evening. Not from suspicion, from habit, from a need to feel that one small boundary still belonged to you. The robe you wore now had an additional fold across the shoulder. It itched, not painfully, just persistently. You never complained. It was tradition, and tradition outweighed discomfort. You still performed rites, but less frequently. Now, your presence was more valuable than your movement. You were the symbol of continuity, the proof that the old still lived, even as the young hurried forward. You spent more time in thought, not because you were idle, because your thoughts were the last ones before decisions were made. You didn't dictate, you advised, softly, rarely. And when you did, your words traveled faster than rumor, because people knew. When the high priest speaks, something shifts. Let's pause here. Feel the air around you. A little cooler, a little stiller. That's what it was like. Not loneliness, just altitude. Where the air thins and the silence deepens. You stopped eating with others, not by rule, by rhythm. Your body no longer digested noise well. You took your meals in the late afternoon. Bread, dates, a small cup of warm barley water. You chewed slowly. You tasted memory in each bite, because by now, every part of your routine was layered, with repetition, with presence, with ghosts. Visitors came only with invitation, even other priests, even nobles, even Pharaoh's messengers. You were not difficult to reach, but difficult to approach. Because people feared wasting your time, and because deep down they feared what your eyes might see in them. One night, you lit the sacred flame yourself. Not because the acolyte failed, because you missed it. The flicker, the resistance of the flint, the soft hiss of oil catching heat. It reminded you that even gods need kindling. Even belief requires tending. You began walking at night again, but now through the inner gardens. The paths no one else used, the ones lined with silent statues and rare trees. You spoke to them sometimes, not in full sentences, just fragments. Still watching? Did it rain last year? I think I'm still breathing. And the wind always answered, not with sound, but with rustle, with movement, with presence. Once, you dreamed of your own funeral, not as a warning, as rehearsal. You saw your body, wrapped, anointed. You recognized the priest, your successor, lifting the incense burner. He looked like you, but younger. He hesitated once, then moved with grace. You woke calm, because now you knew. Even your absence would be held properly. You became more careful with your voice, because by now, your words carried not just weight, but direction. A phrase could shift a festival date. A nod could redirect temple funds. A raised eyebrow could halt an entire political request. So you began using silence as punctuation. And when you did speak, people leaned in, because they knew the fewer the words, the greater the meaning. Let's pause again. Imagine you are the stillest part of the temple, the unmoved pillar, the quiet breath, the gaze behind the veil. You don't need to speak often, because presence, once refined, is its own form of language. You still dreamed, but less vividly. The visions faded with age, not in power, in color, as if the gods, too, respected your exhaustion, and now whispered instead of shouted. You thanked them for that. Each morning, with a bowed head and a hand over your chest, your hands changed. More than your face, they grew slower, not weaker, just deliberate. Each scroll you touched, you read more carefully. Each offering you prepared, you laid down with more thought. Because the world, you realized, did not need more speed. It needed depth. And that's what your hands had learned. The younger priests feared disappointing you, but you never scolded. You simply watched, and when they did well, you nodded. When they failed, you waited and let them come to you. Because wisdom you had learned is not correction, it's invitation. Once, a novice brought you a broken amulet. He had dropped it, shattered the symbol of protection. He wept. You told him. Now it protects your memory instead of your body. He smiled through tears, and that lesson stayed with him for life. You were alone most days, truly alone, but you were never lonely. Because the temple breathed with you, because the gods, though distant, still lingered, because your own thoughts had become companions, and because, at the top of the sacred hill, you had learned the quiet truth. Leadership is not authority. It is containment of chaos, of fear, of sorrow, of hope. You carried it all, not as burden, but as offering. And that was enough. They said you never aged. Not truly. Your face thinned, your hands veined, your steps slowed. But somehow, you remained unchanged, as if time walked around you, as if Mashat herself refused to let you wrinkle. You heard the rumors among acolytes, among visitors. Some said you drank from sacred wells, others that you had bargained with a god. But the truth was simpler and more demanding. You didn't avoid age, you partnered with it. Your secret was rhythm, discipline, stillness. You did not resist time. You aligned with it. You rose at the same hour. You drank the same cup of warm barley. You walked the same path to the shrine. Each gesture a stone placed on the banks of passing time. Each repetition a net that caught the drift of chaos. And the more regular your life became, the more the years slipped past without denting you. Your body slowed, yes, but not with rust, with deliberation. You never rushed. You never snapped. You never reached too quickly or stood too fast. Not because you feared falling, because you had mastered gravity. And gravity, when respected, holds you more gently than youth ever could. Let's pause here. Take a long breath. Feel your own bones, not as burden, but as memory. Every line in your skin, a path walked. Every ache, a message from something ancient inside you saying, I'm still here. I remember. That's what it was like to age as a high priest. Your meals remained small, precise, not out of scarcity, out of calibration. Too much of anything, even joy, disrupted the pulse. So you learned to taste slowly, to chew with full attention, to savor not the flavor but the presence of eating. And in doing so, your digestion remained strong. Your sleep deep, your skin clear, not magic. Balance, the oils helped too. Daily anointing with myrrh, cedar, lotus. Each one chosen not for beauty, but for frequency. They weren't fragrances. They were harmonics. Invisible shields that kept your skin from drying, your joints from aching, your spirit from scattering. You didn't wear them to appear youthful. You wore them to stay tuned. You avoided anger, truly avoided it, not by repression, by redirection. You understood emotion, left untended, corroded. So when frustration came, you moved slower. When sadness visited, you sang to it. When fear approached, you lit incense and walked until it passed. You weren't detached. You were attentive. That was your armor. People asked, quietly, why your hair never returned, why your posture never curled. You never answered, because it wasn't about you. It was about function. You remained a vessel, unchanged, because you refused to fill with things that didn't belong to the eternal. You studied less now, but remembered more. The scrolls had etched themselves into your body. Your hands moved in verses. Your feet stepped in hymns. Your voice vibrated with the sound of 1,000 repetitions. So deeply ingrained, they didn't need recitation anymore. They were embodied. An embodiment, it turns out, is youth's twin. You were surrounded by younger priests, eager, bright-eyed, some too bold, some too afraid. You let them move fast. You didn't correct them often. You waited for questions. And when they came, your answers were fewer words than they expected, but more lasting. Because clarity, like health, comes from stillness. Let's breathe again. Inhale slowly. Hold it. Now, exhale through the nose. That is how you lived. Each breath not a grasp for air, but an offering, a small bow to the universe. Your skin thinned with time, but never sagged, not from tightness, from containment. You smiled less, but when you did, it showed in your eyes, sharp, golden, impossibly calm. Even those closest to you confessed once. It's hard to tell if you're 70 or timeless. You said nothing, because the truth was, you had long ago stopped measuring your life in years. You measured in seasons, in cycles, in rites, in dreams. You had a mirror, a small one, polished copper, kept in a carved wooden box. You looked into it once a year. No more, not out of vanity, out of check-in, to see if the face still aligned with the voice, if the eyes still held the weight they should. And each time, you nodded to yourself. Because while the reflection changed, the presence remained. Your voice aged differently. It grew softer, but deeper. Like water moving through older stone. When you spoke, the syllables rang lower, resonated longer. People leaned closer, not to hear, but to feel. Because your words had become less about content, more about frequency. And frequency, they say, is what the gods listen to. You stopped walking long distances, but your stillness traveled farther than your steps ever did. Visitors reported dreams after sitting with you. Visions. Calm. Sudden clarity. You didn't claim power. You claimed presence. And presence does the work for you. One day, the boy asked, "Why don't you look old?" You smiled and replied, "I do. I just don't move like it." He laughed. You didn't. Not because you were serious, because you were true. Let's pause once more. Feel your heartbeat, that ancient drum inside you. It doesn't ask to be young. It asks to be steady, to be listened to. And that, more than anything, is the secret of appearing eternal. You began writing less, but what you wrote remained. One sentence each equinox, etched into a private scroll, still breathing, still listening, still aligned. You kept that scroll sealed, not for others, for the one who would succeed you, so they would know. You didn't become eternal. You became consistent. And in Egypt, consistency is the closest thing we have to immortality. The mistake was small, barely a movement, barely a breath. But you felt it, deep, immediate, like a crack across still water. A hesitation in your right hand during the seventh offering. A pause, no longer than the blink of an ibis, but long enough, too long. And the room shifted. No one else noticed. The oil still burned. The incense still curled upward. The chant flowed uninterrupted. But inside you, something stopped. As if a thread pulled too tight had finally snapped. And suddenly, every word that followed felt heavier. Not false, just off. You finished the rite. Of course you did. No priest walks away mid-offering. You moved through each phase with the same precision, the same grace, but behind your eyes, a whisper. You hesitated. Afterward, the others congratulated you. A flawless ceremony, they said. The statue was radiant. The air had thickened at just the right moment, a sure sign of divine presence. You nodded. You smiled. But inside, you were silent. Not empty. Just listening. To the echo of that pause. To the space where certainty had been. You returned to your chamber. Alone. Removed your robe slowly. Folded it once, twice, precisely. Then sat, still clothed in oil and scent and memory, and whispered, "Where were you when I faltered?" You didn't expect an answer. You didn't want one. You wanted balance, and balance tonight was gone. Let's pause, breathe deeply. In, out. You've carried perfection for so long. But even stone bends. Even priests tremble. The next day, you fasted. Voluntarily. You didn't announce it. You simply refused food. You drank only warm water laced with a sprig of mint for calm. And let your stomach speak. It said, remember, not the mistake, but the weight of your role. Not punishment. Realignment. You visited the anointing chamber, asked for solitude, lit every lamp yourself, and stood before the smallest altar, the one no one visited anymore, the altar of Khepri, the god of becoming, of mistakes transmuted, of days reborn. You placed a single drop of cedar oil on the stone, whispered, begin again, and stepped back. No thunder, no flame, just stillness, but a deeper stillness, like the temple had exhaled and allowed you back in. In the days that followed, you revisited every corner of your routine, not obsessively, with care. You changed the order of your footfall down the eastern corridor. You used your left hand instead of your right when brushing incense ash. You slowed your breath before lighting the wick. These were not corrections. These were reminders that the sacred does not demand flawlessness. It demands presence. You remembered something your mentor once said. A perfect priest is a brittle one. The gods do not ask for statues. They ask for rhythm. You wrote that down again, on fresh papyrus, and placed it beside your sleeping mat, so that each morning it would greet you before your shadow did. But still, the hesitation lingered, not in motion, in memory. You found yourself waking before dawn, not from dreams, from silence. As if the temple had not quite forgiven you, as if you had not yet forgiven yourself. You began walking further at night, into the northern wing, past the old prayer rooms, into chambers long closed to daily use, rooms where the paint had faded, where old offerings sat dry and cracked on stone, where the air smelled of earth and salt. And in those forgotten places, you knelt, not to perform, to remember that you were not the first to falter, that you would not be the last. Let's breathe again, this time with your eyes closed. Picture a line drawn in sand. Now picture a breeze, soft, uncertain, erasing just part of it. That was your error, not a rupture, a reminder that even in temples, the wind moves. A novice approached you days later. He had heard, not the mistake, but the fast. And he asked quietly, "Did you lose the gods?" You looked at him, held his question gently, and said, "No, I lost myself." The gods waited. He bowed, not in formality, in understanding. You resumed your duties? No different, really, but those closest to you saw something shift. Your hands moved more slowly. Your silences deepened. Your eyes softened. You hadn't broken. You had bent. And the temple, ancient and listening, had welcomed that bend because it had always been alive. And the living prefer honesty to rigidity. You added one more ritual to your day, unrecorded, unspoken. Each evening, before removing your robe, you placed a hand over your chest, closed your eyes, and whispered, "Was I still with you?" Not to ask, to offer, because the answer was no longer the point. The asking was. You wrote a new hymn, not public, just one line. Carved into the frame of the eastern window, the pause is part of the music. Only those who knew the story would notice. Most would pass it by. But you looked at it every morning and remembered. Let's pause once more. Let your breath settle. Think of something you regret. Not deeply. Just enough. Now think of how it made you listen more closely, move more gently, speak more truthfully. That is what your error did. That is what the gods remember. Not the fault, the response. You were not less sacred now. You were more, because you had broken rhythm and returned, because you had doubted and remained, because the oil still burned, and you, though imperfect, still carried the flame. There comes a moment in every priest's life when the echo of the divine falls silent. Not gradually, not as a whisper, but like a door closing. And you stand on the other side and realize the God is gone. You're not alone in this. But in that absence, you are, for a time, entirely yourself. It began subtly. A ritual performed at dusk. Smoke curled outward at the usual tempo. The hymn rose in its measured cadence. Your incense responses were precise. Yet the air felt different. Not lighter, but hollow. Not absence of presence, but an empty weight. You paused at the final verse. A note hung too long. An offering glimmered in the lamp's flame. And then, nothing. Not even silence, just less. Breath's friction against air. Your own. You finished the ceremony. Ritual required completion. You walked the edges of the sanctuary, extinguishing lamps. You opened the doors for the night's cleansing winds. You swept the courtyard of incense ash. But inside, something withdrew. As if the god, having listened, chose to leave. Let's pause now. Imagine a world where your most certain companion steps away, leaving you with the memory of their voice and the shock of their absence. That is what you faced. The next day, you woke early, not from habit, from uncertainty. You lit the first lamp, spoke the first chant, but the echo was flat. No response, not in oil's warmth, not in statue's gaze, not in the turning of your own breath. You walked through the temple. No bird sang, no servant greeted, not because the world had stopped, but because something within had. You wondered, did I forget a word? Offer oil too quickly? Think a wrong thought? All your certainties loosened, and the ground beneath your own feet felt unreliable. You met with the high priest, chambers dim, his gray eyes steady. He did not ask what happened. He simply said, "They wait," and walked away. Not comforting, truthful. You spent the day in the archives, hidden hymns and danger-hidden rituals. You pored over lines written by others who had faced this silence. You found prayers for return, words for retrieval, chants for calling back, presents, but they were not for you. They were for desperate people. You were not desperate. You were present. That night, you performed the night vigil alone. No torchbearer, no acolyte, your lamp alone, your breath alone, your steps alone. You entered the inner sanctum. The statue loomed, veiled, absorbent. You lit the lamp and bowed, then waited. Hours passed. The light flickered. A single moth pressed against the flame, burned, fell, and the darkness held. You chanted, in tongues older than memory. You chanted until your voice trembled, until your throat felt thin, until your own words echoed as someone else's. But still, nothing. You wept, not silently. Tears fell in the dark. They were hot, human, not shame, just sorrow, for companionship lost, for intimacy broken, for a silence too deep to know how to inhabit. Let's pause again. Imagine crying in a room that's meant to hold gods, and finding it empty, but still sacred, because your tears landed there. You stayed at dawn. The priests came. They found silence where there should have been ritual warmth. You said nothing. You didn't have to. They knelt beside you. They did not speak. They lit incense in unison, letting the smoke rise between you and the god's absence, presence by proximity. That day, you did not preach. You did not instruct. You sat. You listened to the sound of others' breath, the flicker of their lamps, the distance of your stillness. Presence returned, not in the statue, but between people bearing absence together. In the following weeks, you actively invited worshipers to morning rites. You asked novices to lead chants, to make mistakes, to see that the ritual persisted, despite its keeper's doubt, despite the god's silence. You went to villages under the temple's care, held ceremonies in fields. You offered prayers to sky and earth, open air rather than enclosed stone. You reminded them, even if the god sleeps, the world continues. The earth spins, rain falls, grain grows, life carries on, with or without divine applause. Let's pause. See yourself standing in a field, arms open, knowing that you must speak even when no one answers, because speech itself maintains the world. You walked home at dusk one evening. No lamp, moonlight only. The air was still, no wind. For a long stretch, nothing. Then, a cricket's chirp. A cricket, small, fragile, but alive. You stopped and listened. A single cycle of sound. And in that moment you understood. Presence is not perfection. It is continuation. You returned to your rituals. Not because the god had come back, but because you had. You carried on. Step by step. Word by word. Breath by breath. And slowly, the air around you began to fill again. Not with divine attention, but with human devotion. And that, you realized, was not less. Weeks blended into months. You never heard the god's voice again. But the lamp glowed, the temple rang. You learned a secret. Deities may come and go, but devotion assembled by human hearts remains. A fire fueled by fallibility, a continuity fueled by choice. Let's have one final pause. Breathe slower now. In, hold, out. You've held absence. You've held hope. You've held ritual itself as form. That, at last, is your answer. Presence, even when the god is silent. And so, the god never did return. Or returned in ways you couldn't measure. Not in wind, not in oil scent, not in statues' gaze, but in rising hymns, in flickering lamps, in fields of grain, and in the human hearts that kept believing. Because you did. This silence became your deepest hymn, your final proof, not of control, but of continuance, that even gods sleep, even gods leave. But the priest, if faithful, stays. There came a day when you stopped waking before the sun, not from laziness, not from doubt, from the simple fact the body no longer needed to lead. It needed to follow. And for the first time in decades, the light found you still sleeping and kissed your skin like a whisper. You stirred, but did not rise. You smiled, because now you knew. The time of stillness had begun. No announcement was made, no decree read. The temple shifted quietly. You were given fewer tasks, fewer ceremonies. You observed mostly. Watched young hands place oil where your hands once moved with mastery. Watched new voices chant the verses you once wrote from memory. Watched and never interfered. Because you knew. Passing on the sacred is not giving it away. It's planting it. And plants do not grow when the gardener pulls at the roots. You spent more time in the gardens, not the inner court. The outer fields, with fig trees, lotus blossoms, the breeze, and bees. Always bees. They buzzed near your ears, landed on your sleeves, and you didn't flinch, because they too were workers of the sacred. Your steps became slower, but not unsure. You moved like stone learns to move, patiently, as if time now walked beside you and not behind. The novices watched with reverence. Some whispered, "He walks like a statue dreams." And you heard them and smiled, because the truth, you did dream of walking still, even while awake. Let's pause here. Feel your own breath. Notice how, even now, it moves slower than it once did. That is not weakness. That is wisdom taking its seat. You began eating less, smaller meals, more water. Your stomach asked for less, and your spirit answered. You craved only warmth, broths, soft breads, dates soaked in honey. And above all, silence. You no longer chewed in company. You chewed in communion. Each bite a blessing. Each swallow a hymn. Some days you sat for hours by the sacred lake, not thinking, not praying, just being. The sun moved across your face. The breeze played in your robes. The reeds bowed in greeting, and the water remembered your reflection, even when you no longer looked. One morning, a child ran to you, not out of duty, out of curiosity. He asked, "Are you a god now?" You bent down slowly, looked into his wide eyes, and said, "No, but I remember how to listen to them." He smiled, and then gave you a flower, not from fear, from joy. The scrolls in your chamber remained untouched, not because they were forgotten, because they were complete. Every word you needed to say had been said, every lesson planted, every silence honored. You didn't need more knowledge. You were knowledge now, breathing, resting, waiting. You started sleeping longer, not deeply, but richly. Your dreams grew stranger, less narrative, more symbols. You dreamt of feathers falling upward, of water flowing inside stone, of names whispered in winds that had no source. And you didn't ask why. You simply received, because dreams at this stage are not messages. They're preparations. Let's pause again. Close your eyes. Picture yourself under a fig tree, your breath calm, your skin warm, your thoughts like birds passing silently overhead. You don't chase them. You simply feel the wind. One day, you stopped attending the great rites. No announcement, no ceremony. You simply stayed in your chamber. And when the novices came to ask why, you said, "It is time for others to speak." And they understood, because your silence now carried the same weight as your presence once did. You gave away your oils, your robes, your scrolls, piece by piece, not in ritual, in rhythm, one to each student, each given not as possession, but as continuation. You told each of them, "Take this not to remember me, but to remember yourself." You kept one thing, a small carved stone, given to you as a novice, plain, round, smooth from years of touch. You placed it by your sleeping mat and whispered to it each night, "You've held my pulse. When I am gone, keep it warm." Your final days were not dramatic, no prophecy, no sign. Just breath that grew slower, waking that grew gentler, and a body that, piece by piece, began saying, "I'm finished." Let's pause one last time. Place your hand over your heart. Feel that rhythm. Know that one day it too will slow. And in that slowing, something ancient will stir. And remember you. You died alone, but not lonely. Your final breath came in the late hours of dawn, before the chants began, before the oil was poured. You died facing east, wrapped in linen, surrounded by the scent of cedar and myrrh. And your face, calm, as if listening to one last secret only the gods could say. The novices found you. They did not cry. They did not shout. They simply bowed and began to prepare the body as you had taught them, with reverence, with rhythm, with presence. The funeral lasted 4 days. Crowds came, not to mourn, to honor, to remember, to reflect. The man who had become ritual, who had held silence so well it had become song. And your tomb, simple, lined with verses. No gold, just stone, and one inscription. He breathed with gods and listened longer than the wind. The temple did not fall silent after you died. It inhaled, paused, shifted, and began again. Not out of habit, out of rhythm, because Rhythm, once etched into stone and breath and routine, does not end. It changes hands. The morning after your funeral, the novices woke early, earlier than usual, not from fear, from longing, from the strange emptiness in the air that comes when a steady voice is suddenly gone. And they knew. Today, they had to become echoes of that voice. They lit the oil with trembling fingers, not out of inexperience, out of reverence. They chanted the hymns slower, listening not only to their own voices, but to the silence between them, wondering if you still lingered there. And perhaps you did. Let's pause. Imagine walking into a room where someone used to sit, and the chair is empty, but the air is not. That is what the temple felt like. The senior priest stood before the statue. He hesitated. He had performed the rite 1,000 times. But this was the first without your eyes watching, without your breath behind his, without your silent nod as anchor. He bowed and said nothing, because some offerings do not need words, only presence. The rituals continued, but they changed. Not in structure, in tone. Your absence had weight, and that weight shifted how the temple moved. Not heavier, more aware, as if each step now walked not only for the gods, but for you. Your chamber was not sealed, not yet. It remained open for 7 days. No one entered, but offerings appeared at its door. A bowl of water, a folded robe, a scroll of blank papyrus. No names, no notes, just gestures, each one saying, "I remember." After a week, the chamber was closed, not with locks, with linen, a white cloth draped across the entrance, the same way you once veiled the statues before high rites. And behind it, silence, not absence, a sacred hush. The scrolls you left behind were copied, carefully, lovingly, but never altered. Because your voice was not just in the words. It was in the spaces between them, the way your hand curved around the glyphs, the slight pressure where emotion carried into ink. And the scribes understood. To change them was to forget you. So they preserved and let others interpret. Let's breathe. Inhale slowly. Now imagine your breath is carrying a name, not spoken, just held. That's how they kept you alive. A novice named Nefru was the first to inherit your stone. The one you placed by your mat. He found it not by command, by intuition. He entered your chamber on the 14th day, allowed by right, and sat in silence. And there it was, by the wall. Warm to the touch, still. He didn't ask for it. He simply placed it in his palm and whispered, "I will remember." Years passed. The temple changed again. New rulers came. The Nile flooded, then receded. Famine once touched the outer districts, but your name stayed. Not in speech, in gesture. When someone walked slowly through the sanctuary, others said, "He walks like the quiet one." When a chant ended with extra silence, they said, "She sings like the final flame." No statues were made in your image, no feast days, no offerings. But the roof of the sanctuary bore a single mark, a line carved in old script. The pause is part of the music. And every priest learned it, not by rote, by feeling, because it was the only instruction you had ever written in stone. And it was enough. Let's pause again. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel the air in your lungs. Now imagine that someone long gone walks with you in silence. That's the kind of legacy you left. The gods, too, remembered. At least, that's what the priests believed. Sometimes the oil would burn longer. Sometimes the incense would curl in strange patterns. Sometimes the statue's gaze would seem warmer. Not signs, not miracles, just echoes of a priest who once listened more than he spoke, and spoke only when the gods themselves grew quiet. One winter, a group of scholars from the north arrived. They asked about the nameless sage whose rites were still quoted. The priest smiled and said he had a name, but he wore silence more comfortably. They offered the scholars no scrolls, no relics, only an invitation. Stay a while, watch, you'll hear him. And they did. Not in words, but in rhythm, in balance, in how the temple breathed. Years turned to decades. The young became old. The rites evolved. But always, always, your pause remained. Some called it the quiet breath. Some the listening step. Others simply the way he stood. No one claimed to replace you. Not even your successor. They simply walked where you once walked, breathed where you once chanted, and each, in their own way, carried a piece of you. Not as burden, as guidance, like a thread tied gently to the wrist. And so, you lived, long past your final breath. Not in echo, not in monument, but in motion, in the stillness before speech, in the breath before prayer, in the silence that somehow feels full. You're no longer just a man. You never were. But now, after all the rites, the words, the breaths, the silences carried across decades, you have become something else. You have become eternity, not in the way statues or gold endure, but in the soft, living way that memory, rhythm, and ritual can carry a spirit across centuries. This is your final chapter, a homecoming not to flesh, but to purpose. It begins where the last chapter ended, in the silence after your passing, in the empty chamber draped in linen, in the stone carved with the line you left behind. He breathed with gods and listened longer than the wind. You died, yes, but death in Egypt is not an end. It is a shift, a folding. Someone, a novice perhaps, found your stone, the smooth talisman, still warm from the life it had carried. That moment was your first step into eternity. From then on, your legacy lived. But this chapter is not about what you left. It is about what continues. Your silence now speaks. Hear it. Feel how the temple has absorbed you. You, the whisper-turned echo behind each lamp, each hymn, each rising breath. There is no longer a body to remember. Only meaning. Not belonging to you alone, but to everyone you touched, truly touched, with ritual, with stillness, with integrity. The story continues in their steps. There are countless scenes now, fading into tradition, growing into legend. The novice Nefru, holding your stone as if it were a seed, planting it in his palm, whispering, "I will remember." That photograph is etched into temple lore. The weight of your presence held in a boy's hand. The line carved in stone across the eastern lintel. The pause is part of the music. Not a lesson text, a rhythm. Spoken less often than felt, but known by instinct. Every priest, young, old, learns to breathe it in before reciting hymns, before touching oil. Wordless reminders, offerings at your chamber's door, a fig placed at dawn, smoke curling in the shape of your name, the temple breath itself. The temple no longer needed your voice. It needed the echo, and the echo became part of the place. Your absence changed the air. Lamps stayed lit longer. The oil burned more evenly. By subtlety, the temple remembered to be steady. No one can recall now who carried your replacement role first. It matters less. The voice changed. The rhythm remained. Your lineage was rhythm, not blood. Let's pause. Breathe in the memory of steady presence. That's how you live now, not in flesh, but in continuity. A traveling merchant stops by and observes the temple. He notes the quiet, not emptiness, but presence. He recalls 2 decades ago, hearing how a quiet man who spoke little held the temple steady through famine and flood. He mentions statues, he mentions walls, he mentions incense, but above all, he mentions silence. He doesn't know why, but when he leaves, he hurts less, as if a portion of the temple's calm came with him. That is your legacy. A scribe writes about the finest chant heard yesterday, but in the margin, he notes, we chanted his verse, paused just as he would, and the silence swallowed our worries. He doesn't name you, doesn't need to. The effect is enough. A scholar from a distant land visits, wanting to record the temple's traditions. He asks, where did this line come from? The pause is part of the music. He receives smiles instead of scrolls. He watches the novices chant and pause, imprinting the discipline in their bones. He listens. He says, later. It is as if the whole place remembers something it never forgot. That's your immortality. Across seasons, there are small miracles if you believe in them. A painting cracks, revealing your stone embedded in the wall behind it, exactly where a novice once knelt. A sacred lamp burns out, then reignites with no wind in the first moments of dawn. A rain cloud parts exactly when libations are poured. Harvest yields double in the next year. None of these are written in sacred texts. They're scribed in memory and passed along in silence. Years become decades. Decades become centuries. The temple surpasses dynasties. Your name echoes as memory, as rhythm, as lineage. Let's pause again. Imagine your stone, warmed once by your hand, now buried deep in temple floors. Imagine every step across that stone carries a remembrance, balance, presence, stillness before speech, silence not as absence but fullness. Pharaohs come, religions shift, invaders pass. The temple changes, but the eastern lintel remains. Some call it archaic, obscure. Others consider it the temple's heartbeat, the unspoken pause before divine presence. In later times, scholars translate the lintel line into Greek and Latin. They debate its meaning. It becomes a philosophical tenet. They quote it, in silent patience lies the cosmic harmony. Women at a distant well quote it when comforting children. A hermit priest in a monastery chants it before meditation. The wind carries it. Your voice has become no single sound. It is now many. Let's breathe now. In through the nose. Hold. Exhale. You are timeless. No longer waiting. No longer gone. You are part of the music. Stillness carries weight. Balance persists. Presence remains. Your story ends, not in death, but in the weaving of being into eternity. That is your final gift. And so, in the place you once called home, the temple no longer remembers the man. It remembers the stillness, and in that stillness, you live forever.